Welcome to the Spy Collection Digital Edition. I'm Anastasios, and here we will look at a digital artifact from 2011 which was leaked in March 2015 by Edward Snowden. It's a presentation on the cyber threat capabilities of Canada's CSC agency. CSC was previously known as CSEC, and you can think of it as the equivalent of the United States NSA. Its name stands for Communications Security Establishment, and it started in 1946 with a mission to protect Canada's communications and collect intelligence from the adversary's communications. This slide deck has significant historical value since it revealed for the first time the cyber threat capabilities that CSC had in 2011. Some of them might have been expected, others might have not, but regardless of personal perspectives and opinions, it's an important digital artifact to include in the Spy Collection. Although the quality of the leaked content is not very low, many of the slides seem to rely on transitions to be properly understood. So, just like in the previous videos, I reconstructed the entire slide deck to present it to you. The title of the presentation was Communications Security Establishment of Canada, Cyber Threat Capabilities, Signals Intelligence and Information Technology Security, an End-to-End Approach. Those two, SIGINT and ITS, were both divisions of CSEC, and this presentation was there to demonstrate how they were collaborating to provide cyber threat capabilities to the Government of Canada. You can think of ITS as the directorate responsible to advise and provide guidance on how to implement cybersecurity controls, for example firewall configurations, malware protection, and so on, and SIGINT as the traditional intelligence agency that monitors the communications of the adversaries to provide insights on their tactics, techniques, and procedures. On the top of the document we have its classification with three qualifiers. The first one is top secret. This is given to documents that, when compromised, might reasonably cause exceptionally grave injury to the national interest. The next one is COMINT. COMINT is communications intelligence. It means information that was gathered from communications. And lastly, we have the release to the Five Eyes. This means that this document was authorized for release to the Five Eyes. Five Eyes is an intelligence sharing agreement between 5 countries: the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The next slide is giving us some definitions to make sure we all speak the same language when we are talking about cybersecurity. Specifically, it is telling us that for the CSC, cyber means the detection, discovery, and tracking of state-sponsored hacking, the counterintelligence reporting, mitigation advice, and defense against cyber threats. To achieve this, the SIGINT side of CSC is detecting cyber activity. To do that, they are using the access they have to Canadian and Allied collection to discover and track covert networks. On the other side, the IT security defends against the cyber activity detected using the sensors they have in the Government of Canada networks to identify malicious activity and enhance their defenses. Now that we all have an idea of what cybersecurity means for CSC, we can move on to the next slide, which is the comprehensive presentation of the cyber capabilities. How this works is that we have the Internet and Canadian networks that interact with the Internet, and of course the Government of Canada that is protected by the ITS, the IT security that was described earlier. In Canada, the legislation also has this Section 16. Section 16 describes the law enforcement and investigations for security. So you can think about it, things that allow the Government of Canada to conduct things such as surveillance, collection of intelligence, and so on for legal reasons. This is the warranted information. Then you have the special source. Special source means access to information that it is not openly available, such as interception from ISPs and other activities like that. And since Canada is part of the Five Eyes, they also have access to information coming from the Five Eyes network. Since we're talking about SIGINT over here, we shouldn't forget about the computer network exploitation, the CNE. In simple terms, that means hacking. CSE is able to hack into adversaries' networks and obtain intelligence from this source as well. All of this combined are the sources for cyber activity. Those are being selected and filtered, and the output of that is sent to the Communications Security Establishment of Canada, the CSE. CSE is then doing the processing and enrichment, such as protocol analysis and making sure that they understand what is collected in there that is relevant to cyber threats. If something is encrypted, they will try to break this encryption, so a crypt attack. And if it is not encrypted, or it has been successfully decrypted, it will be put in a data repository for further analysis. Then network analysis is taking place to find out what network activity was detected, and cyber analysis is conducted to understand better the cyber threats that are being detected. The output of that analytic work is then forwarded to the different agencies. For example, intelligence might be sent to the Government of Canada. Counterintelligence might be sent to CSIS, which is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and their job is more or less to find spies that are spying on Canada. Then threat evaluations will be sent to the IT security so that they can better protect the Canadian government, and of course there is a continuous knowledge transfer between Canada and the other partners of the Five Eyes Agreement. Now that we have an overview, let's dive into more details, starting with the grand challenge, the detection. The presentation starts with the EonBlue. It describes it as a cyber threat detection sensor developed and deployed in SIGINT and ITS, and is doing cyber threat tracking and cyber threat discovery. EonBlue is a program for monitoring and passive collection on the SIGINT side. You can think of it as a sensor that sits in areas where the SIGINT side of CSE has access to and continuously monitors for certain cyber threat activity. How it's doing that is with signatures, which means it has some predefined behavior that it's looking for, or through anomaly-based detection. So let's say, for example, an increase in traffic or some network activity that wasn't supposed to be there. Then it explains to us that EonBlue was a 6+ year effort that incorporates the best breed of detection algorithms and technology in collaboration with the Five Eyes partners. It is based on classified knowledge, it scales to major ISP network speeds of over 10 gigabits, and it enables rapid prototyping to adapt to ever-changing threats. As described earlier, EonBlue is sitting in ISP networks and other close to the public sources, and is doing this form of automated cyber threat tracking and discovery. And on the right side, we have a very simple schematic that shows us what EonBlue consists of. It is telling us that it is doing target discovery based on anomaly detection. It is providing metadata that are used for situational awareness, and is continuously tracking targets using signatures. But why was detection a grand challenge for the CSE in 2011? This is what the next slide is about, the cyber landscape. Here CSE was telling us that the cyber landscape consists of the adversaries and the targets. All of them operate globally, they have varying degrees of sophistication, and they are constantly changing their tools and techniques. Because of that, the detection and discovery implies that tools must operate at all network speeds. They should provide deep packet inspection at scale. And in simple terms, this means being able to get access to the network traffic and inspect exactly what is going on through this traffic. Then it is telling us about targeting tradecraft and protocols versus individuals. And the last point says we must live in cyberspace, which I assume it means that CSE was in this modernization phase to get more into cyber than traditional SIGINT. The next slide is asking why is cyber critical? And again, this is a slide deck from 2011. What we see is that it was explaining that North Korea had the Nodong ballistic missile with range of 1300 kilometers, and this is shown as a blue circle in the map. Later on, they developed the Tai Podong missile, which was also a nuclear ballistic missile with multi-stage that could get to 2900 kilometers. Again, the range is shown on the map. And lastly, it is showing us that with just a desktop personal computer, the range is the internet. And of course, the cost is lower, and it could be anything. For example, here it says that the payload could be a distributed denial of service attack, and it could reach out anywhere in the internet. Of course, this was a simplification of how cyber warfare is generally cheaper than the equivalent kinetic options. Now, working in cyberspace means that tools must adapt constantly and quickly to provide signature-based targeting, metadata analytics, and custom tradecraft for discovery. And for how someone could do a better job working from their home, it is to enhance and enable collaboration, adopt internet technologies on classified networks such as Skype, video chat, Google applications, and so on, and centralize the cyber analytics to what is referred here as a cyber DMZ, a demilitarized zone. Following this, we have a case study for discovery, specifically for SeedSphere. That was a malware developed by China for cyber espionage operations. Typically, this kind of malware is referred to as an implant, since the adversary, China in this case, is implanting this software into victim devices to enable their intelligence collection goals. What we read is that EonBlue program, its anomaly detection utilities, isolate network anomalies, discover network beacons in warranted full take collection. In simple terms, this means that EonBlue was able to identify some anomaly that tricked them into looking further for potential SeedSphere infections. Using the knowledge that was developed from this, they shared it with the CNE, the Computer Network Exploitation teams. And computer network exploitation is hacking. So during those hacking activities, the CNE activities, the implant was found to be cohabitating. This means that the implant was in a system that the CNE team also had access to, and they were able to copy this implant to the CSEC headquarters for reverse engineering. Because of these operations, they were able to allow the IT security to detect SeedSphere attacks against the government of Canada on a weekly basis. But where are all that data being stored? And this is what we read in the next slide, called repositories at collection site. It is telling us that Global Access is pushing tradecraft to the front end of Access, with 50 terabytes of high-speed storage and processing over 135 gigabytes per hour of HTTP metadata. Again, we're talking about 2011, so those numbers were pretty big at that point. But what it's telling us and showing us also in graphs over here is that there was a large amount of data being processed close to real time from all of this network access that those programs provided. Specifically, the graphs that we see on the left side, on the bottom we have the CPU usage, which as we can see it was pretty low. It hit a maximum of 20%. And on the top side we have the cluster throughput in terms of the file system access, the file operations. And the black line denotes the data into the cluster, and the blue line the data outbound from the storage area network. Data deduplication at site results in much better use of limited bandwidth. This means that if there was duplicate copies of some dataset, they were being consolidated to one copy. This is the data deduplication for performance reasons. And here we also see how they developed a distributed system to take the most out of this repository of data. The comment says that data into the cluster is balanced across multiple nodes. Each color denotes a separate node, automatically dividing the load amongst all systems. This is the definition of a distributed system, so instead of having one system serving all of the data, you have multiple of them to spread the load across all of them. This subject, the repositories, continues to another slide, telling us that in 2009, an average of 112,794 IP traffic items related to cyber threat were collected each day from Canadian and allied sources. Traditional SIGINT sources prove invaluable in cyber threat analysis. For example, travel tracking databases used to attribute hacking activity, or CNE activity, along with SMS collection. The IT security domestic sensors, and again, to make it easier to understand, domestic sensors in this context means firewall devices and network analysis tools that the IT security has deployed into the Government of Canada. Store 300 terabytes of full take, and full take means full network traffic, not only metadata, but also the content, the full traffic. This enables equivalent to months of traffic, and it enables historical analysis and anomaly detection. Using that, in 2009, the IT security was able to take 95 mitigating actions. This means that they were able to detect some cyber threat in their networks and take some action to remediate it. If you recall, on the comprehensive cyber capabilities, step number F was the network analysis. And this is a representation of that. What we see here was the different interactions and links between internet providers and key networks for the Government of Canada. This allows the CSE to better assess the cyber threats and the networks related to those. If you recall, in this step, apart from the network analysis, we also had the cyber analysis. And how this was done in 2011 in CSE was following the process described in this slide. The first step is the tasking and collection. What this means is that if you know that the adversary is operating in specific networks, the task is to get access to those networks and collect data from them. Once this has happened, what follows is the traffic analysis to identify the threat activity. Typically, all of the adversaries will use some sort of malware or implant to achieve their goals. Once CSE analysts get access to this malware, they had to do reverse engineering to find out exactly how it works and all of its unique features. Once they had all of this information, they could proceed to the network analysis, which is what infrastructure this malware is connected to. And with all of this information available, they could construct a report, a cyber report, that could be shared with the different stakeholders to help them protect their networks. But what is the value of this product, a cyber report? The following slide talks about the mitigation for systems of importance of the Government of Canada. It is telling us that direct protection of Government of Canada systems and information through prevention and response activity, leveraging SIGINT and 5i intelligence complemented by Government of Canada's domestic sensor capabilities. And those reports had two sides. One, it was the actionable technical mitigation reports that were provided to the client's IPC, which means it was specific steps that they could take to protect themselves. And the other was the cyber threat situational awareness report provided to entire departments to be aware of what cyber threats are after them. And as we can see on the right, this allowed cleaning up and strengthening the networks, advising and guidance to the leadership, proactive defense since they knew the threats before they were going to attack them, and active defense, which means actively taking measures to protect the network. But apart from this, CSEC was reviewing incidents against systems of importance, and CSEC analysts were deployed to capture technical evidence and develop support mitigation activity when incidents were happening. This allowed detection and discovery through real incidents that were happening in the Government of Canada. To simplify this, it means that when some agency or organization of the government of Canada had an incident, CSEC was sending their analysts to find exactly what is happening and discover and detect new threats that they might not know of. The final step is that the information that CSEC has collected was merged with all source cyber threat activity to create a complete picture of the cyber threats. And this is what provides the concept of defense in depth. Now that we have a good idea of how CSE was operating in 2011, let's move to the next slide that talks about the future. Positioning for the future. On the horizontal line we have the timeline starting from today and going to tomorrow, and on the vertical line we have the mission going to the outcomes. The mission, it is relatively clear, it's the cyber threat pursuit, and how to achieve this mission is by enabling access and analysis through detection, which means discovering and tracking state-sponsored hackers, description, which means evaluating those threats, and defense, which is protecting the Government of Canada assets. The outcome of this access and analysis is defense and counterintelligence. This was a nice overview, showing to us what was the plan for the future at that point, but how was this happening in practice? This is what the following slide shows us. It's the synchronized SIGINT and ITS mission space. And to better understand this, you need to know the mandate of CSE, which is still valid today. The mandate has three parts. The part B refers to the cyber defense. The part A is the traditional SIGINT, and the part C is the assistance. Let's start with the mandate part B, the cyber defense. Here we have the internet, the global information infrastructure that leads to the Government of Canada. In there we have communications from domestic to government, foreign to government, and government to government. Apart from this, CSE also maintains a TKB, that is a target knowledge base, a database of individual targets. All of these communications have sensors that are being forwarded to Photonic Prism. And do not confuse this program with NSA's PRISM program. This is a separate one that what it's doing is consolidating the data from all of these sensors, processing them, and eventually storing them to different databases, specifically to low-speed rich content, cyber metadata, and cyber events. Apart from this, there is another source which is government tips that is coming outside of the Photonic Prism flow. What is happening next is that the CTEC, that is the Cyber Threat Evaluation Center of CSE, it is receiving the cyber events and is doing a cross-correlation. It is also receiving the cyber metadata and is doing a threat evaluation using this source. But everything we discussed up to this point was ITS, the IT security. Everything is happening within the Government of Canada without any form of signals intelligence. This is why this is part of the mandate part A and C, the signals intelligence and the assistance. So if we have a closer look here, we will see that in this side we do not only have data from Canada but also from foreign sources. Specifically, we are talking about communications for foreign to domestic communications, foreign to foreign, domestic to domestic, and wanted domestic. That is the section 16 described earlier. There is a separate TKB, a target knowledge base, with individual targets of interest for SIGINT. But here's the first synchronization that happens for the combined mission space. Instead of having those separate target knowledge bases, there is a joint TKB that both can use for the same purposes. This information feeds to the Eon Blue that we described earlier, and it is processed and separated to separate datasets. For example, high-speed cyber events, cyber metadata, high-speed content, and warranted rich content. Just like in the other case, all of this is joined to a single repository to have a combined mission space, which means output from both Photonic Prism and EonBlue is part of the joint repository. This allows cyber events and cyber metadata to be consumed by both sources into CTEC, the Cyber Threat Evaluation Center, and provide higher quality products on what are the cyber threats that were targeting the Government of Canada. Earlier in this presentation, it was shown that the output was two separate intelligence products. One was tactical to help the teams immediately mitigate a cyber threat, and the other was the situational awareness. This slide explains to us what situational awareness means for CSE. First of all, it gives us a definition that situational awareness is the perception of environmental elements within a volume of space and time. How this is achieved is through the comprehension of their meaning, projection of their status in the near future, and insight, meaning the capacity to understand hidden truths. In the cyber context, it means gathering and enabling access to cyber information, such as event metadata, event content, and near real-time exchange. Also, data mining of cyber information to create understanding in broader context. And the reason of that is to predict the adversary's actions based on this knowledge. Following this slide, CSE was giving an overview of how cyber session collection was happening in 2011. Here we see a victim computer infected with a malware implant that tries to do a domain name lookup for evildomain.org, a domain owned by an adversary. For some reason, the DNS server returns an invalid value, so the implant remains idle. After some time, the implant does another lookup, but this time the DNS server returns back an IP address which belongs to the actor's infrastructure. The implant then connects to this IP address, allowing the CNE actor, the computer network exploitation actor, to do remote command and control of this victim computer. This is how a cyber session collection was taking place in 2011, but what CSE was doing to disrupt it is described in this slide. On the ITS side, the Photonic Prism program was monitoring the Government of Canada. At the same time, on the SIGINT side, EonBlue program was doing the same for special sources. Both of them were collecting traffic and were storing events in their separate storages, in the ITS event storage and in the SIGINT event storage. That was accessible through the NRT alerting engine. NRT stands for Near Real Time, and the decision of this alerting engine was from a system that was getting input from multiple different sources, including the other 4 eyes of the 5 eyes agreement. Based on this logic and the NRT functionality, the ITS analysts were getting alerts on cyber threats they had to mitigate, and the SIGINT analysts were also having an RSS feed of things they should be looking at. This entire system was built to provide tips to the ITS and SIGINT analysts. And this next slide talks exactly about this. It is telling us that on the SIGINT, the data volume and network speed impose severe temporal restrictions on collection. You either use the data or lose them. The ability to extend cyber target tracking across all 5 eyes accesses and/or analytic event stores instead of just domestic, a global aperture. The ability to uncover covert overlay networks. And about the cyber session collection, uncovering tradecraft, binaries, and exploit vectors. On the ITS side, or the CND, which stands for Computer Network Defense, there is a concept of the network edge versus the network core, which is like a microscope versus a telescope. Network edge refers to the edge of the network, like the perimeter, while the network core is the inside of the network. Here we read that it enables mitigation of cyber exploitation and/or attacks, concept of dynamic defense. It facilitates indications and warnings. Can SIGINT provide me with a true threat picture in NRT? Could we detect test firing of new tools and techniques? Collaborative defense. Can my partners see malicious activity in SIGINT against networks I need to protect? Can they tell me in NRT? And to give a practical example of the value of those tips, this slide shows SIGINT to ITS tipping, a sample of computer network operation tips provided to ITS from SIGINT Special Source Operations on 5 May 2010. Some content is redacted, but it is still visible that SeedSphere, the malware framework from China, and Super Drake threat actor have been active in some systems in the government of Canada. All of that coming together results into the dynamic defense. How this works is that on the perimeter of the network edge, the ITS is providing localized tailor mitigation such as blocking, binary neutering, redirection, and so on, and focused response to ongoing and potential threats. If a threat manages to infiltrate further into the network core, the SIGINT takes over with global mitigation possibilities such as redirecting traffic, null routing and filtering, and a large-scale but still focused response to ongoing and potential threats. Finally, the adversary space is the CNE, the computer network exploitation, where this team can do reconnaissance, probe, explore, and learn about the adversarial network space, but also cohabitate, which means hacking, cover network infrastructure for information gathering, tool extraction, etc. How all of that fits together is in the next slide, the cyber activity spectrum, and it starts with a base which is the defensive operations from commercial, industry, and relationships. It starts with commercial defense such as antivirus software, firewalls, and so on, and influencing those technologies by providing them with signatures of malicious behavior, threat actor activities, and so on. Supply chain and also political demands, meaning political initiatives relating to vendors that might be relevant to some adversary activity. While still on the defensive operations, the next layer is the network monitoring techniques. Things such as tracking known threat activity, monitoring for discovering new activity, and maintaining a lightweight network sensor. After the network activity techniques is the host-based defense that has things such as red teaming. This means getting a team that is going to simulate a real adversary in order to identify any vulnerabilities before the real adversary does. Host-based intrusion detection systems to identify intrusions on the host systems, and also running your own defensive implant in those systems that looks for malicious behavior. The last part of defensive operations is the dynamic defense technologies. This includes things such as blacklisting IP addresses, controlling the domain name resolution so that you can redirect or disrupt the traffic, and also traffic alternation, for example removing malware from incoming traffic, or traffic redirection, such as redirecting a threat actor to a fake network, and also traffic alternation on the outbound traffic, for example inserting malware in a communication. Having completed the defensive operations, the next stage is the passive operations. This is a traditional SIGINT where, apart from the network monitoring that is already provided by the defensive operations, this one provides the same kind of monitoring but on the adversary's network. Whether this is an international network or a domestic network, it provides visibility from the other side of the cyber activity. Going one step further on the passive operations, we have the deception techniques. For example, here we're reading leveraging the special source operations for indicators and warnings. This means getting an early warning of what the threat actor is planning on doing, and based on that you can create honey tokens, honeypots, or honeyNets. All of those are fake infrastructure that resembles the real Government of Canada infrastructure that the SIGINT is closely monitoring, so that if the threat actor goes after that, they can find out exactly what they are doing. And also we see two effects that are moving to the offensive side, such as creating false flag operations. For example, masquerading one threat actor's activity as another's to cause some political tension between those two countries. Or you can alter the adversary's perception based on what they are going to be seeing in those fake networks. The last part is, of course, the active operation or offensive operations. Here we're reading that the CSE had the capability to do computer network exploitation for OPSEC monitoring, that means operations security, so to find out how the adversary's implant operates and look for mistakes. The other was CNE pursuit, which means getting access to the adversary's infrastructure in order to obtain those implants and other tools that they might have. Another thing that we're reading is the CNE pursuit with implant on adversary infrastructure, which means not only hacking into the adversary's infrastructure, but installing your own implants in there. The CNE insertion through Quantum is a program for network exploitation. The CNE disruption then, it is saying to take over the adversary's infrastructure and to control it so that they are going to lose control of it, and this can also enable false flag operations or other activity like that. And CNE disruption by disabling the adversary's infrastructure, for example, taking down the servers, cutting off the network connectivity, and so on. And lastly, we have a CNA, a computer network attack, and that is to destroy the adversary's infrastructure. For example, execute a denial of service attack, delete all of their infrastructure, erase all of their file systems, and so on. The last example of this presentation is a dynamic defense scenario explaining how all of the previously described techniques fit together. In this scenario, there is an adversary system that is being monitored with the methods described earlier, that through the internet it is trying to get access to network A. In this network, there is an inline defensive device that detects this behavior. Because of that, when the system tries to attack network B, it is being redirected to a fake network, to a honeynet, where passive collection can happen so that the SIGINT can understand exactly how this threat actor operates. This means that when they try to attack a new network, not only the computer network exploitation action fails, but also CSE is able to hack back the adversary's infrastructure in order to execute some offensive operation. And finally, the next steps in this 2011 presentation from CSE were split into two parts. In the domestic side, it was to synchronize the SIGINT and ITS mission, as explained, the alignment with the cyber strategy, funding, joint approach for domestic partners, recruitment and staffing for growth, joint capabilities development, sensors and analytics, and things to consider were the legislative amendments and develop a career framework. On the international side is the tipping and queuing, the interoperability, policy coordination, and Five Eyes interoperability and policy. Finally, the presentation ends up with this slide, which suggests that everything we discussed probably wasn't all in place at the time of this presentation, and likely this presentation was part of promoting this idea of SIGINT and ITS collaboration for cyber threats. And with that, let's go back to the original slide deck. From this important historical digital artifact, we learned the first steps of Canada's CSE into cyber threat intelligence, classified intelligence collection programs such as Ion Blue and Photonic Prism, and the unseen spy versus spy activities that happen for more than a decade in the cyberspace. But in this profession, nothing is as it seems.